Well, it's 12:05. I think we'll start today. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Association Xchange. I'm Sherry Singer, president of Singer Communications, and I help associations solve their marketing, public relations, and communication challenges. I've been running Association Xchange for the past 5 years. We're almost ready to celebrate our 5-year anniversary in April. And I wanted to just say a quick thanks to my co-organizers, Jamie Ballou, Adam Hostetter, and Kirk Gallagher. Without you guys, we definitely could not do this. Also, I wanted a few housekeeping notes. Please, if you have a comment or a question for Kevin, our speaker today, please feel free to put that into the chat. I will be jotting down your questions as they come in and comments, and then I'll be sharing them with Kevin at the end of the presentation. So we're going to ask you to hold your questions till the end, but please feel free to write them into the chat box as you think of them so that they don't disappear off the top of your head as you're listening to Kevin's exciting speech and presentation today. I also wanted to remind everyone that our next meeting will be on March 14th and will be focused on membership, managing volunteers in a new environment. Our speaker is Peggy Hoffman, and for anybody who has not had the pleasure of hearing Peggy speak, she is awesome, and I encourage you to jot that down on your calendar, March 14th with Peggy Hoffman, Managing Volunteers in a New Environment. So let me take a minute to introduce our speaker, Kevin Helm, today, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin. Kevin wears a lot of hats, but today he's known as the founder of the Virtual Association Network, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that when he starts his speech. He's also the executive director of ASSET, the Neurodiagnostic Society. So Kevin, we're so pleased that you're with us today, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Sherry. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, and we can get started. I've got about 25 minutes of content and then some questions afterwards. So I live in Kansas City. Most of you know that as the home of the world champion Chiefs. Had to throw that in there. I have been married for almost 32 years. I've got 3 children, 3 cats, and 2 dogs. And I've spent about 25 years in association management, 15 years with a major medical association. And that's where I got my start in virtual. I had a very willing supervisor that let me experiment with working 1 day a week. That was born some really interesting data. Anecdotally, I think I was about 3 times more effective or efficient working from home, which was a big surprise. Then I jumped to an organization and I was there for 5 years. They were born virtually, which was unusual pre-COVID. And we'll talk about them here and there throughout the presentation. And then I've been about 4 years with my current society, and we completed a transition to fully virtual in November of 22. And as Sherry mentioned, I'm currently the co-founder and president of the Virtual Association Network, as well as executive director for ASSET, the Neurodiagnostic Society. So I'm guessing in most of the audiences, and I don't want to belabor this, but just recognizing that there are probably individuals in the group that are currently working 100% virtually. Some might be in a hybrid environment. Some of you may still be in bricks and mortar or are just considering virtual. Hopefully, some of the insight gained today will give you an approximation of what that world looks like. But afterwards, if you have questions, certainly feel free to email me. Sherry probably can provide my email address. The PowerPoint can be made available, but also my email is in the last slide. And again, feel free to email me anytime. All right, let's start looking. Most of today's presentation is going to focus in on our annual benchmarking survey. But before we get started, just a little bit about the VAN, the Virtual Association Network. The mission is that we are dedicated to fostering a community of association professionals operating in a virtual or remote environment. Again, we were founded in 2017 with David Westman, who is a management consultant as well as an executive director. We were working on an unrelated project and started talking about the organization I was in, and we realized this is this is kind of a unique situation. So let's reach out and see if there's anyone else out there. And what we found was it was fairly common for organization to have a few remote staff, or let some of their staff work 1 day a week remotely, but it was unheard of to be completely virtual at that time. Our organization, which was born virtually, we had 15 employees, 4,000 members, a $5 million budget, and we were very successful working in that virtual environment. So David and I began exploring, how do you build and support that kind of structure for those of you who want to move virtually? What kind of resources would they need to be successful, etc. We soon learned that, again, there was a cohort of associations that were kind of in the dark corners operating virtually, and we were able to find those and communicate and connect with them. And we started holding bi-monthly meetings and just talking about what's the issues that we deal with. So over the past 6 years, we've grown to a community of almost 200 association professionals. There's no membership dues. It's completely networking group. We meet every other month and have usually a speaker, very similar to what we're doing today. Most of those organizations are already remote or hybrid. And then, just as you can imagine, with no employees, no staff, anything, we are limited in what we're able to do. But one of our core focus activities is the survey, which we will now dive into. So this survey is done annually, and we call it our benchmarking survey. The first survey we did in 2017 had 21 participants, and we thought we got a great response rate. This is now the 5th survey, and it's grown to 157 participants. It is an instrument that is constructed by the VAN Board of Directors, and based on previous year questions, looking for longitudinal issues that we want to track, as well as new issues that may have popped up. For this particular survey, there are 89 questions that go across kind of general operational issues, member related issues, and human resources related issues. And those broke down into HR administration, employee issues, including performance management, hiring, termination, retention. And then one that we will touch on at the end, it's kind of unique to virtual world, is governance compliance, and in a way that I was not anticipating. So with that, again, 89 questions, takes about 26 minutes to complete. That is a very long survey, and that partially explains why we have 157 respondents instead of 2,000. With that being said, out of those, 112 completed the entire survey, and then the rest completed portions of the survey. We do allow folks to complete portions of the survey, especially around those longitudinal questions, because some data is better than no data, we've come to expect. All right, moving to the next slide, we're going to talk now about, again, just the key findings. This is not everything in the survey, but some of the highlights that we felt that this group might be interested in learning about. And I know slide and survey data is not the most exciting presentation, so I will try to add some anecdotal comments without going too far off the rails as we go through this. Who responded? It looks a lot like the rest of the association world. 75% of the respondents have budgets less than $5 million, although we are seeing, we are seeing more organizations with larger budgets considering the move to virtual. It is shown in the result of this, there were a few organizations that responded that had budgets over $25 million. 83 of the respondents had 25 or fewer employees. So again, medium to small organizations are still dominant in the virtual space. So looking at who is currently remote and what has changed with COVID, as you can see, nearly 60% of the respondents are completely remote. Another 80% let their staff work at least 3 days remote. What has been interesting is this gold section on the right graph is 62 of the respondents, help you decipher this, 62 of the respondents have increased the amount of remote work by 50% in their organization. So we cannot ignore the impact that COVID has had on, and I think everyone is well aware of the impact that it's had on enabling virtual associations to exist. All right, so how does, one of the big issues is either before becoming virtual or currently, how do you justify this to your board of directors? One of the two areas that are most often mentioned, and again, nearly 90% of the respondents talked about this, that recruitment and retention of staff is greater in a virtual environment. It also should be noted that while there is a perception of significant cost savings, our experience and the results as well in the survey is that's really only a minimal impact because you have offsetting costs that are incurred with going virtual. For our association, that means 1 or 2 in-person staff meetings per year, which involves travel costs. All right, moving on. Some of the biggest challenges that we face used to be more oriented towards technology, especially pre-COVID. During COVID, all of us witnessed the explosion of Zoom, and we actually used a program at our virtual organization prior to Zoom. And it's just, here's an anecdotal, it's interesting it would be a great case study. Reminds me of Beta and VHS, where Beta was probably a better product, but they just did not take advantage of marketing opportunities or market opportunities. Same thing, Zoom really stepped into that space, although there are an increasingly number of competitors now. But going back, just the technology was raw. We've seen a huge increase in leveraging technology in a way that helps an operational aspect of an association operate virtually. The difficulty now that we're seeing is how do you build community and culture in that environment? How do you collaborate between departments? And then again, mention another issue that is really interesting that's popped up this year is the state-specific regulatory compliance. When you've got staff in different states, how do you manage that from a tax and compliance standpoint? A lot of things that are being used currently by the respondents demonstrated how do they address these. They, especially the cultural, specifically to more of the cultural. There is not yet a prescription for how do you build culture in a virtual environment. So I'm sharing some of the responses that we heard. One is to schedule virtual meetings. We all know that for everything. Instead of just an email or necessarily a text, it's the face-to-face. It's the next step down from a face-to-face meeting. We do that with staff, departments, directors, leadership teams, supervisor, subordinate, like one-on-ones, etc. We do, in addition to an in-person staff retreat, we also hold a virtual staff retreat. We schedule our respondents, ad hoc virtual social meetings are popping up more. You may have heard things like virtual coffee breaks, celebration during holidays, work anniversaries. How do you build community through celebration of staff life events like weddings and baby showers? Some folks are doing virtual meals or happy hours. That seems successful. Some are also doing special purpose virtual get-togethers like brainstorming on book clubs or fun contests, just different ways. What we're seeing too from the respondents is a much greater increase of utilization of communication tools. So things like Slack, Teams, Yammer. I don't use Yammer, but we saw that a few respondents. the the increasing environment and the part of this, I think probably everyone now knows and appreciates a spectrum of engagement from different communication tools. Probably the least engaged is something like an email or a text. The most engaged, I would say, is in person. So we are trying to get as close to that in person. And the thing we've heard most, how do you do that? Was cameras always on policy whenever you hold a virtual meeting. Okay. So moving to this, I love this picture. This is when the day we closed our office, and we all had smiles on our face and we're waving goodbye to a better world ahead of us. So when we had and this has been universal since the first benchmarking survey, was how do you build a virtual team in this wide open market and space? And so some of the things that we've asked about, and that's what this slide is around, those types of how do you build a team, how do you bring them on, and so forth. Most of the respondents both interview and onboard new employees only virtually. What we found is only at the executive level usually do they pull in for a final in-person interview. Some of the key attributes, not surprisingly, when you're hiring remote workers that were mentioned by the respondents, strong communication skills, ability to work independently, being a self-starter, self-directed, and definitely an ability to use and leverage technology. One of the things that I look for is someone who's a little entrepreneurial in nature. I think all of these things are embedded by that type of aptitude. The thing we have not found, and we've asked this, is how do you screen for these attributes? And that is still, that along with cultural issues seem to be an unsolved issue currently. We brought up supervisory techniques. How are they different if you're virtual versus not virtual? The results from the survey, there's virtually no difference from in-person staff for nearly 90% of the respondents, other than a little bit more focus on outcomes and results. Increasingly, with that being said, we're hearing something along the lines of results-oriented work environment. And there's actually I don't want to promote it necessarily, but there is a consultant who has developed this. It's called ROW. They call it a results-only work environment. Our organization has adopted as results-oriented. I was talking to a couple of other organizations, and we saw it on the survey. The idea is that in this environment, the culture needs to place more focus on the outcomes rather than the process. And that's primarily because you don't see your colleagues day to day. You can't walk down to their office and check on their work and give a response in a way that is conducive to an immediate feedback loop. And additionally, as one might anticipate, there is a prevalence of outsourced service utilization. 48% of the respondents outsource their accounting or financial management. 20% of the respondents use some type of outsourcing of human resource management. We use a professional employer organization, or a PEO, and that's been great for our organization. I think we're going to see an increasing adoption of that, if nothing else other than benefits management. And then 57% of the respondents also outsource their technology or information services management. All right, drawing to the last slide, some of we thought this would be important too, because this is a recurring question, especially for new virtual organizations, is how do you base your salary ranges or bands? 41% of the respondents base it on national data, 32% base it on where their headquarters is located, and surprising to me, was only 13% organizations really try to make it employee location specific. The feedback we have heard is one of the reasons that is because there's a belief that if you work for a virtual organization, you can move wherever you want. So we will set, is what we're reading into the data, we'll set our salary bands based on the headquarters or national data, and then let the employees themselves decide if they want to move to a higher rent area or a lower rent area, or a community that has, they have that flexibility. The other thing that was interesting, this has come up, do organizations still provide medical benefits and full benefits? Nearly 80% of them still do, which I think is very similar to what we see with associations in general, is right around that 80% of full benefits. Nearly 50% provide a stipend for office expenses, and that ranges anywhere from $500 to $1,200 annually. For our organization, we provide each of our staff $100 a month to help offset high-speed internet, the increase in utility costs. That's kind of a philosophical, cultural item too. Some organizations that responded specifically said, the benefits of working remotely are great enough to offset any additional cost. Or how much does it cost in annual expenses to support a virtual employee? And nearly 90% of the respondents indicated that their office-related annual expenses per employee are less than $2,500. And then the last time I want to mention before we wrap up is back to that regulatory requirements. One of the things we've learned is something called a registered agent. And in each state in which you operate, you are mandated to have what's called a registered agent. And that is someone who acts on behalf of your organization for primarily legal filings. So if there is someone who serves you a summons within a state in which you have an employee, you are bound to have a way of receiving that. A lot of times, and the justification from what I've heard is that a lot of times you have 30 days to respond to a legal item. If you don't have a representative in that state, it could get lost in all the communications trying to get it to especially because most of those are mailed. So there are organizations that will help you set up the required paperwork and registration of managing your staff as a registered agent. Each one of our staff who resides in a state by themselves is themselves a registered agent on behalf of the organization, which simply means if something happens in the state where we are served with a legal notice, it goes to that individual. Again, going back to why that's important is it's difficult for a small staff organization to manage it. So we're seeing that as an increase. Nearly 40% of the respondents now are starting to use outsourced professionals to help manage that aspect. All right, I probably talked a lot and too fast and too slow for some of you, but that'll wrap up the content. There's my email, and I'd love to answer any questions.
Well, while we're waiting for people to write questions, thank you, Kevin. That was really, really insightful and enlightening. And I, for one, learned a lot. I hope everybody else did too. And as we're waiting for people to write questions in, a couple came to my mind as you were speaking. The first is that you mentioned that this seems to be more of a trend in small associations. Do you think that larger associations will embrace the virtual model in the future? And why do you think large associations are not as likely to embrace the virtual model?
Yeah, so we are seeing trends of larger associations doing something virtually, whether or not it's a hybrid or, and that is a trend, I think, because for a variety of reasons, but I narrow it down usually. I think they are cultural issues and scaling of technology. in a large organization, usually we see more in-house experts. So if you're going virtually, what happens to those? What happens to that technology? And there's a barrier to outsourcing your IT department. There's a barrier to outsourcing your accounting department and so forth. So that's what I'm kind of lumping in the cultural items. But one of our current board members, they are one of those large organizations. They have a $25 million plus budget, and I think over 100 employees. They have committed to going 100% virtual, and they've been making that work for the most part. The other part is how do you manage that? That's one reason the Virtual Association Network was created, is to build a resource library. We have not been very good at that. So it's really, that's why a lot of people will come to the meeting is, we're thinking about going virtual, and these large organizations have more buts than the smaller organization.
Okay, thanks for that. We had a question come in from Bruce, and he says, any thoughts on the biggest things that we need to be thinking about, issues that you had as you closed your physical office? Were there mail issues, storage issues, more outsourcing issues, etc.?
Yeah, you'll most likely uncover something you didn't think about. So anticipate the unexpected. I think for us, when we move virtual, and the best experiences that I've seen is preparation and planning. That is so critical if you're thinking about moving fully virtual. And if you are, I would certainly encourage someone to come to a van meeting or connect with the van. And we have examples. We could connect you with people who have made that transition. There was an organization here in Kansas City. They spent about a year and a half creating this plan to transition. That's vastly different than an organization that says, hey, let's move virtually. And then they uncover specifically, we did save money with the leasing, but again, you have moving costs. We now have storage costs. We have a 10 by 15 storage facility that is packed. So we need to now probably upgrade. We also house our historical items. How are you going to get your mail? We have a virtual mail company. It's pretty cool. I don't mind sharing names, but I don't want to imply that we endorse them. But iPostal is a service with our local PostNet office. Each piece of mail that comes in gets scanned. So I can look at it and see what kind of mail is there. And then I'll go once or twice a week, depending on the volume, and pick our mail up. And then I have virtual banking. So I have a scanner where I deposit all of our checks out of my home office. So there are lots of things to learn, but almost always there is a service that will let you do it virtually.
So you mentioned in your presentation some items, some characteristics of like entrepreneurial characteristics that you look for in hiring somebody as you are a virtual organization. How do you screen for those traits as an ED when you're looking for those, very special type of people, and not necessarily the association staff that says, this is the way we've always done it, we have to have an office, and are very steeped in tradition? How do you find those people?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Sherry, we are still experimenting with the question part of it. We have not found a ideal question that gets to the heart. The strongest indicator for us that we've learned and we've discussed is, have they been successful working in a virtual environment or a remote environment? So we actually are currently, while we'd love to move that talented individual and move them into the fully virtual environment working for us, we place a lot of emphasis on, have they done it already? Have they been successful? That's the best indicator for us. Otherwise, it's just questions around, do you enjoy working by yourself for prolonged periods of time? how do you manage that, self-manage? And you're looking for things that you can imagine. It's this balance between being able to know what I need to do that day, that month. I have ownership over that, but I'm not opposed to reaching out for help and communicating. And I know the role of appropriate transparency and communicating with my colleagues. That's a skill set that is hard to look for through an interview. And that's why we go back to asking if they have the experience and how did they manage that experience previously.
I think it's really hard to predict even for yourself because I'm an extrovert. And when I went in as an independent consultant in Marcom, I was really worried about not having an office to go to and not having that inner activities with other coworkers. But I actually found, and I think a lot of people discovered this during the height of COVID when they were working from home, that I was far more productive working from home, and that I then was able to choose the way I wanted to socialize with other people. Might not be my coworkers, but it might be like a neighborhood walk group, so I had more control over what I was able to do in terms of being an extrovert. Another question is, you mentioned the best way to, a couple of the best ways to build community. What do you think, in your experience with Van and the people that are in your network, what would you say are the three best ways? You mentioned a book club and this and that. What do you think from your experience, anecdotally? I know this wasn't probably part of the survey. What do you think are the three best ways or a couple best ways to build community?
Yeah. The first is all of your staff meetings should be virtual. I think that's kind of a given now, but it hasn't been. The other, I would encourage a social aspect to either your staff meeting. So we start our staff meetings with celebrations, life celebrations, and that helps. I work for a group of they're neurodiagnostic technologists. By definition, that means nerd. And that means that I don't want to talk to you about my social part of my life. So we've tried things. But other groups definitely find that a social hour, a lunch hour. There's one group that they have great success with a happy hour on Fridays. That would never work for our group. But they get together and they just spend 30 minutes. We've also, so those defined periods of social interaction outside of business, a lunch together, a happy hour together, a catch up hour once a week, something like that, works real well. And then you've got to do an in-person meeting. I think it's critical that you bring your staff together outside of your annual conference at least once a year.
So Jennifer Baker wants to know, are you finding virtual employers that are instituting formal probationary periods to help both sides determine whether or not and ensure that the fit is going to be good?
Occasionally. We do hear that occasionally. I think part of that goes, I know for our organization and other organizations, sometimes it's cited the, I'm blanking, I call it no fault, where termination, you don't have to have a reason for terminating. We're here in Missouri, we can terminate at will. So we don't find a benefit of a probationary period, although we have an informal probationary. We have let staff go within 2 months because it was obvious they just aren't working. But so there's not an effort to do that outside of what organizations are already doing, is from what we can tell.
Candy Rollins says that the employees in her organization, while remote, they live in the same town. So they meet at a coffee shop once a month for an in-person meeting. And then Celia Basur added in that she's in the same situation as Bruce, who asked the original question, and their group has decided, their association has decided not to renew their lease and to go for, fully virtual. So she may be a candidate for your Van network. So
Delia, I would encourage you to, I will try to keep your email here if I get it, but go ahead and send me an email too, if you want to join the virtual network. Um, back to the comment about the same town. I've heard that very frequently with organizations that have just switched to virtual. Everyone lives in the same town. They just don't work in the office anymore. And it's a weird thing because now we used to see each other every day. So let's get together. Folks are doing lunches as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a former client and they had a big office, like 100 employees. And right before COVID, like the year before COVID, they had a fire in their building, which mandated that they all work from home. And their executive director thought, well, this is going so smoothly. Why would we have this big building? You know, this really frees us up. So literally right before COVID, they put their building up for sale and they were going to be fully remote anyway. And then COVID really forced their hand into that. And I think they held on to the building till after COVID. But I think I've heard more and more, and that is not a small, I think 100 employees, 80 employees, that's not a small association by any stretch of the imagination. So I think the trend may be that more of the larger associations will be embracing some format. It may not be 100% virtual, but at least a hybrid where people are working in the office some days and not. So this was really a great presentation, Kevin. Thank you so much for your valuable insights and for sharing the results of this survey with us. I remind everyone to join us again on March 14th for Managing Volunteers in a New Environment with Peggy Huffman. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.